Okay.
All right, we are live this afternoon on January 11th to continue our overview of the criminal and civil justice systems. And we're going to start with Commissioner Jennifer Morrison, who is going to be sharing the screen with us. And if you could just introduce yourself and we'll proceed. Thank you very much, Commissioner.
Great. My name is Jennifer Morrison. I am the Commissioner of Public Safety for the state of Vermont, and I am trying to show the screen that has the full-size slide. Can you tell me what you see?
I think we can
See the facilitator version, it looks like.
I think it's fine. We're seeing there's what is it called? The facilitator version? This is beyond.
So we can like see your notes.
Yeah, we see the notes as well, or no notes.
No worries. I can fix that.
There you go.
All right, very good. So we've made this resource available to you. It is far denser than I think we have time to get through today. So I'm going to gloss through it and hit the highlights, but we figured this might just be a nice resource for you to have going forward. So this is an overview that my team has prepared, and it covers a variety of areas related to the structure and oversight of Vermont law enforcement. All law enforcement officers have their authority derived from statutory language. In this slide, you'll see the language from 20 VSA 2351. And it talks about the different types of police officers. And so the question of who can exercise law enforcement powers really boils down to anyone who is certified by the Vermont Criminal Justice Council as either a level 1, 2, or 3 certified officer. And on the following slide, we broke down what that means to be certified at the different levels. And without, taking your time to dive into the specific bullet points, I think it's the main point of the slide is to say that there are different scope of practice for the different types of police officers. If you have any questions, just shout it out, because I will be focusing on the slides and not so much on the view of the Zoom.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. So what is the structure of the different law enforcement entities in the state? And it's broken down into local resources, county resources, and a variety of state resources. And on the following pages, we have gone into each of those to give you more detail. So at the local level, there is a constable, if it is something that is in that community. And then there may be a municipal law enforcement agency. And we've broken down whether they are, how they're created, whether they're elected or appointed, what a general, very high level summary of their authority or duties are, what their jurisdiction is, and whether or not certification is required. So again, this is just meant to be a resource for those who may not have a lot of experience with the law enforcement landscape in Vermont. There are 56 local law enforcement agencies in the state. I do not know how many constables there are. In the absence of 24-hour coverage in a community, the Vermont State Police provides coverage in those communities. And sometimes agencies exceed their own resources, even if they do have a local police department. And in those cases, they either gain assistance from other municipalities through mutual aid agreements, or they would reach out to the Vermont State Police, who is always the backstop in cases whether that's resources are exceeded or special teams are needed. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. And on this slide, we've included that key voices when talking about issues related to local law enforcement include the Vermont League of Cities and Towns and the Vermont Association of Chiefs of Police. At the county law enforcement level, there is the Office of the Sheriff. It is a constitutional office elected every 4 years. And there are very specific duties that are specifically the purview of the sheriff. But you will notice across the 14 counties that the sheriff's departments look very different one from the other. Some provide full service investigations, traffic control, like everything you would normally see in a municipal police agency, and others have a much more narrow scope of duty. And they do not need to be certified to hold the office of sheriff. Again, it's an elected position. At the state level, as seen on the previous slide, there are numerous entities, and we've tried to give you a little bit of an overview of each of them on the following slides. And it points out some of the subtle differences between them. But for instance, the mission and the scope of the Vermont State Police is very different from the Capitol Police. And that's why we put these on this first slide, is to just show you that there's, even though they are all state law enforcement officers, there's very different scope of mission between these two entities. That being said, I'll go back to what I should have said on the slide related to levels of certification. When you are certified as a law enforcement officer in the state of Vermont, your authority is statewide. There is no, like, you lose your jurisdiction the minute you cross town lines or county lines or anything like that. It is statewide law enforcement certification. UVM Police Services falls into one of these state entities, as well as the National Guard Provost Marshal Office. These are maybe not things that you're familiar with or think about in the day-to-day law enforcement realm, but UVM obviously serves a community all of its own and works very closely with the Burlington Police and neighboring police agencies. The scope of practice of the National Guard Provost Marshal Office is fairly narrow, and it's specific to National Guard members only. This tells you a little bit more about the Provost Marshal's role, just because it is unique, and sometimes I'm not sure that this will come up in your discussions, but we put the information in here for you. Other type of state entities include the Secretary of State has investigators that focus mostly on the 60 licensed professions, and they primarily focus on regulatory matters. And then they have a small cross section of their cases that involve crimes, and the sworn investigators in the Secretary of State's office would handle those. The Attorney General's office has investigators as well. They primarily focus on the area of internet crimes against children and Medicaid fraud investigations. The Board of Medical Practice also has investigators. Again, it's similar to the Secretary of State's office. They conduct both civil and criminal investigations of all the people who are regulated by the Board of Medical Practice. Fish and game wardens, obviously they are full-fledged and fully certified law enforcement officers, but their scope and mission is not just on enforcement, but also on preservation and education, and stuff specific to our natural resources and preserving the same. Liquor control investigators are housed within the Department of Liquor and Lottery, and they focus on obviously liquor law violations of stores that sell liquor and cigarettes and things like that. They also do investigations related to place of last drink when there is a fatal crash involving someone who is suspected of having consumed alcohol at a licensed liquor establishment prior to the crash. Motor vehicle inspectors come in two flavors, basically. They have the uniform inspectors, who are out in the beautiful marked units that conduct field inspections. They crawl around under trucks to check for safety violations. They look at the logs, and they ensure that the vehicles and the drivers are complying with all the federal and state laws and regulations related to these big rigs on our road. They also have a detective branch over at DMV, and they regulate, monitor, and audit the activities of everybody involved in the administrative side of the motor vehicle world. That would be stolen inspection stickers or forged or fraudulent documents, compliance with the total abstinence program, etc. So they have a uniform and a detective branch. What we suspected that your committee might have some interest in the last 10 years of law enforcement accountability progress. So we put together a timeline for you that I can walk you through. And again, we can provide more info if any of this is you're like, I don't know what that means, or you want more info on it. Just shoot me a note and my team will put together more info for you. We went back just about 10 years, and it was in 2014 that the state introduced the tiered certification level and put those guardrails on what the scope of practice of an officer at each certification level is. At this time, we also enacted policies on eyewitness IDs, fair and impartial policing, made roadside data collection mandatory, and mandated policies on custodial interrogation were promulgated. 2 years later, in 2016, there was further legislative action to limit the use of drones and license plate readers. And it was also the first time that the state had a statewide body camera policy, body-worn camera policy. In 2017, the disciplinary authority of the Criminal Justice Council was expanded, and specific categories of unprofessional conduct were described. It's also in 2017 that it became mandatory for all police agencies to have a, quote, valid internal affairs process or program. And there were also regulations passed regarding hiring practices, such as if the chief in one community wishes to hire an employee, a police officer from another community, the agency that the officer is currently working at is obligated to give a truthful assessment and provide access to any disciplinary records of the employee, so that it was, for lack of a better word, this was about not passing the trash, right? So that law was passed.
Commissioner, can I ask a quick question on that?
Sure.
The regulated hiring practices, all these various initiatives and policies, do they all apply to all the agencies, including the sheriff? And for instance, the regulated hiring practice, does that include the sheriff's office as well?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
In 2019, statutory language was passed criminalizing sexual exploitation of anybody in police custody. It also established a mandatory statewide fair and impartial policing policy, and it exempted law enforcement officers from employee privacy protections. Again, more transparency about officers moving from agency to agency. In 2020, we had a banner year for police reform, and I worked very closely with your chairperson on a variety of initiatives. It's interesting to note when we do the timeline that in January of 2020, just months before COVID turned everything upside down, the commissioner at the time, Mike Sherling, promulgated a modernization plan, a vision for what the statewide modernization of policing services might look like, and that was posted on our website in January of 2020. That spring became a very turbulent time in our communities. In August of 2020, the governor issued Executive Order 3-20, which also focused on modernization, and it made it mandatory for all police agencies in the state to adopt the statewide policy on use of force, or else they could no longer access training that is supported by the state. So, i.e., you can no longer access the Vermont Police Academy. Subsequent to the governor's executive order, legislation was enacted that prohibited restraint, called a prohibited restraint, which we'll come back to, and it created the state's first duty to intervene law, meaning that if a police officer witnesses another police officer using a prohibited restraint, that they have a legal obligation to intervene. I told you 2020 was big. It's huge. This is also the year. Go ahead. This is also the year that the Vermont Criminal Justice Training Council, they dropped the T, renaming it the Vermont Criminal Justice Council, and expanded the number of seats on the council up to 24. We also adopted further requirements relative to hiring practices, and it became legislatively mandated that the council adopt a model policy on body-worn cameras, and that if a police agency outfits their people with them, they must follow that policy. Also in 2020, we enacted a moratorium on facial recognition technology in law enforcement, and we tied grant funding and access to the training to agencies adopting the statewide use of force policy that was built about the law, built on the statute. So we'll come back to that in a future slide. And then in 2021, we amended the use of force law to change prohibited restraint to a chokehold to be more specific about what it is that was the prohibited restraint. So when we think about the use of force law and policy, obviously we started with the statute, and that process itself was very process heavy. There are a lot of engagement from all kinds of groups. I have listed, I shouldn't say my team listed 4 of the key pieces of the language of the law that creates the foundation for the statewide use of force policy. So once the law was finalized, we engaged in a robust process to build the policy. And again, this policy is compulsory for all law enforcement agencies in the state. As we built that policy, of course, we had several appendices that needed to be built, in particular, Appendix D, which focused on law enforcement encounters with people experiencing mental impairment. And I have to tell you that engagement process was one of the most robust I've ever engaged in for any process in my law enforcement career. And then we developed a multidisciplinary team of law enforcement professionals, use of force instructors, folks with the mental health crisis training, and we did multidisciplinary trainings all over the state to ensure that every police officer in the state had access to the training on the new use of force policy and legislation. We also developed online slide decks with voiced over narration for both line officers and for supervisors. So that's the history on the use of force law policy and the process by which we got there. When we think about unprofessional conduct, complaints about unprofessional conduct are certainly within the purview of the Vermont Criminal Justice Council. We're going to talk in a minute about what that might look like also at the local or state level. But as mentioned previously, the council certifies officers, and what they giveth, they can take away. And we've referenced the statutes that give them their scope and authority to take certain actions against a law enforcement officer's certification. And basically, those are sanctions that go from a censure, warning type thing, all the way up through decertification for certain conduct. I put in here that it's important to note that the council does have a staff attorney position and they do have an investigator position, but they're both vacant and have been for a while. So while there is a very clear framework for investigating some of this, there is admittedly a backlog in misconduct complaints because they don't have the staff necessarily to churn through them as quickly as they would if both those positions were full, continually full. So Act 56 is really when people talk about law enforcement accountability through the council, you'll hear them reference Act 56. And so it is the statute that defines unprofessional conduct, and it organizes bad conduct into certain categories. This statute also required all law enforcement agencies to adopt effective, and I believe the word they used was valid, internal affairs programs to investigate and address complaints about unprofessional conduct. And also it required reporting to the Criminal Justice Council whenever an agency, a home agency, receives certain types of complaints about conduct. So there's 3 categories of unprofessional conduct, and category A are the big ones. These are the felonies type thing. The category B is gross professional misconduct, and they're described in the statute so that when you make a complaint to the council, you know they know how to put it in the right bucket, and there are different procedures that attach to the different types of allegations of misconduct. So as I mentioned, Act 56 also required that agencies have a valid investigative process internally. And if the council determines that your internal affairs policy is invalid, they have the ability to run an independent investigation. And the statute lays out this language for things that might make for an invalid investigation. I'll just keep going because I just want to be sensitive to time, and you guys can digest this at your leisure.
Well, that's great.
Because I know you have so much leisure time. Okay, so what happens if the unprofessional conduct is alleged to involve the chief executive of an organization? That's the sheriff or the chief of police. And all of those have to be referred to the council if the allegation involves the head of the organization. And the council then creates an alternate course of investigating a chief executive. And interestingly, in Act 56, the statute allows the Criminal Justice Council to continue to do an investigation, even if the officer resigned before an investigation was completed, or even if before it was begun. So when we think about discipline and how it happens across different police agencies, at the Vermont State Police, and I can only speak to the state police, I don't know how the other state entities handle their discipline. Our process here at the Vermont State Police is extremely clearly laid out in statute. And in statute, all state police troopers are mandated reporters of internal misconduct. And you will note, I believe, on a future slide in here, maybe it's not on this one, it might be something else. Over 75% of the internal affairs complaints that we have received in the past 3 years have come from members of the organization. So folks take this mandate very seriously, and folks report when they see something that does not sit right or that they clearly know is wrong. The commissioner is assisted by the State Police Advisory Commission, which is a civilian body that counsels and advises me on management, supervision, and discipline of Vermont State Police members. We also have an Office of Internal Investigation that is staffed by a state police lieutenant. However, the chain of command is that person answers directly to the commissioner. They are intentionally set outside the chain of command of the Vermont State Police so as to remain independent. And the Office of Internal Investigations investigates or causes to be investigated all allegations of trooper misconduct and reports same to me. If criminal conduct is suspected, we also have a mandatory report that the Internal Affairs Office sends to the Attorney General, the state's attorney of jurisdiction, and the governor's office. And we also report to the council by statute. So at the county and municipal level, if it's executive officer misconduct that is alleged, it goes right to the Criminal Justice Council. In localities and municipalities, there is statutory language that provides oversight. I can tell you that there's a pretty wide range of specifics about how internal affairs complaints are handled in the agencies that I was the chief of in Burlington and Colchester. We had very robust internal policies, but we also had in Burlington, we had a police commission and a city council, of course, and in Colchester, we had a select board and a town manager, and they also were involved in providing oversight and in decision-making processes, in advising the chief, basically, is what I should say, on internal affairs. At the county level, the deputies serve at the pleasure of the sheriff, and each sheriff could have their own process, or they could have, I don't know what they do, candidly, because these are all at-will employees. So the last piece of this presentation is we built a glossary for you for all of the terms that appeared in this slide deck. We wanted to that you didn't know what they were, and so we just provided that glossary for your consumption.
That glossary was definitely very, very helpful. Thank you. We do often do too many acronyms. Before we get to any questions, just first of all, thank you for being here, and thank you for stepping into the commissioner's position as well. And I really appreciated the exemplary process that was done, that you led with respect to the use of force policy. That was terrific, and I thank you for that effort as well. And I think that we have a really good policy. I will ask just one question and then turn it over to other folks who have questions. and that is how the training is going with respect to the use of force policy. If you can give an update on that.
Sure. So my team basically built the training around the policy, but we then turned it over to the Vermont Police Academy since it really is theirs to deliver it. And so we worked with their use of force instructor cadre and other advisors to get the final product. We turned it over to them. As I said, we did the statewide kind of barnstorming to get the initial training out there. And at the end of 2021, there was about a 90+% of all sworn law enforcement officers had taken the training, either online or in person. And that other 10%, it's unclear because some of them could have been deployed or on long-term leave. But in terms of right this minute, how many people have taken that? I can't answer that because it's a police academy initiative. After the initial barnstorming, it lives with the academy now.
Okay. All right, great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Karen?
Yes, thank you for this. I feel like it was great that you focused on these areas that the committee explored before. So it was a way for me to get caught up and hear these. I'm curious for one thing. Sounds like it's a very thorough process around looking at professional misconduct, and that the Vermont Criminal Justice Council is the kind of point agency for that. I'm curious who has access to that information. And I guess one example I have of it is like, say a law enforcement officer is transitioning from one agency to the other. Do they have access to that information okay.
Yes, that was part of one of the reforms I showed you on the slide, is that you're required, as the agency where an officer might be going out of, leaving from, you're required to give them all information related to disciplinary actions of that officer.
Right.
And P.S., the CEO of the taking agency, the receiving agency, is required to ask. And that's actually probably the harder piece, is to remember to ask, right?
Yeah. Great. We got the checks and balances.
Correct. I do have to go to Senate Gov Ops in about 2 minutes, so I just want to.
Okay, yeah, we'll certainly. One last question, I think.
We'll keep that in mind. Good to see you, Commissioner.
Good to see you too, sir.
Just wanted to touch base with you. The only slide that I saw that I noticed wasn't there was federal law enforcement entities and that relationship that we have by statute. And the only reason that it comes to mind is we amended that at the end of last session to include Veterans Administration Police.
Oh.
Okay. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Oh, I appreciate that. I'm eyeballing one of my attorneys right now. I think we're going to keep this slide deck as a resource so we can update it and accordingly. And I appreciate that tip. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. We don't want to keep you away from the where the money is. So we'll see you in the future.
Okay, I appreciate your time, and I really sincerely appreciate all the work that you guys are doing. I know this is a grind, but we are looking forward to partnering with you in the upcoming session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, and now we're going to move to Eitan Nasreddin Longo, and you're going to tell me if I've mispronounced your name, Eitan. All right, excellent. But nevertheless, please introduce yourself.
All right. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Eitan Nasreddin Longo, and I have a lot of different hats that I wear within the state. But at the moment, I'm here to talk to you about the rather musically named Racial Disparities in the Criminal and Juvenile Justice System Advisory Panel, which I have the privilege of chairing. And I had thought I will give you I'm going to sort of tell you a story in a sense about what we've done and what we're continuing, in fact, to do. Before I do that, though, I want you to know that the enabling statute for the panel is Act 54 of 2017. And the panel is I won't say unique, but I would use the rather problematic term fairly singular, in that it is comprised not only of governmental actors, but of also community members who are drawn from diverse backgrounds to represent the interests of communities of color throughout the state, and who've had experience in working to implement racial justice reform. And those people are all appointed, well, most of them, 5 of them, are appointed by the Attorney General. The enabling statute was revised partly under the work of Representatives Christie and Lalonde. We were initially to sunset. We are not sunsetting. We are charging right ahead. And the the executive director of racial equity was added to this panel because that position didn't exist back in 2017. That the executive director then got 2 people to appoint as well. So we now have 7 community members out of 15 who are there. It makes it a really rich experience when it all starts getting a little bit too governmental. There's a significant body of people to pull it back, and if I may use the vernacular, to keep it real. And that happens on a regular basis, trust me. When the panel was initiated, there were one of the big project that the panel had to do was create a biennial report. And there were certain things that the report had to take into account around the criminal and juvenile justice systems. And then we were allowed to make any other recommendations as we saw fit. The first thing that we needed to do was to consider how to institute a public complaint process to address perceived implicit bias across all systems of state government. I won't, of course, read the report to you. You can find it quite easily. But we were looking at that point at the Human Rights Commission, thinking that that was a good home for it. We spent a lot of time talking with Bor Young about it. And there were changes. I think not as many as we hoped. I think Director Yang would probably want more than she got, but we were at least able to begin the process. The second thing we were to do was to consider whether and how to prohibit racial profiling, including implementing any associated penalties. Now, as I say, this is what we were told to do by statute. Let me assure you that we are an unruly group of people, and we didn't do this part. And the reason we didn't do this part was because it occasioned an amazing amount of discussion and, in fact, disagreement, not unhappy disagreement, but disagreement. And we decided to table that for our next report, which will be due, and my math is going to sound completely crazy, but will be due in December of this year. And I'll explain why the math is crazy in a moment. But we will get to that. The last thing that we absolutely were supposed to look at was whether to expand law enforcement race data collection practices to include data on non-traffic stops by law enforcement. Now, as I say, this is a sort of a laundry list of recommendations that this very diverse body of individuals came up with. We meet once a month on the second Tuesday of every month between 6 and 8 p.m. It's not a lot of time. We do the best we can with what we have. I get a little fascist sometime in running things, just to make sure we move along. What got seized upon, I think, most directly by the legislature when we submitted this in 2019 was this issue about data. One of the things that we were able to notice was that the different organs under the criminal and juvenile justice systems had wildly different protocols for data collection around race, and wildly different systems for instituting those protocols. And in some cases, they were completely incompatible. There was a feeling on the part of the panel that, in fact, it is difficult to direct policy without good data telling you exactly what the disparities look like. Now, not to the exclusion of other forms of data. And Robin Joy of the Crime Research Group can speak very eloquently about the use of qualitative data, and has in fact helped us enormously. The participation of the why do I keep doing this? Crime Research Group has been indispensable to the panel. But we don't need to, in fact, wait until this is solved. But we do think that it needs to be solved. And so did the legislature. So we were asked then to create yet another report about what we would do to solve it. And out of that came a recommendation for another body that has had wildly different terms as it's been conceived. It's now known as the Division of Racial Justice Statistics, and it was passed last session. Currently, the Office of Racial Equity is putting out calls for people to, in fact, staff that division. We wrote the report. The report was felt by members of the legislature not to be, well, I won't say that they felt it was not detailed enough. Let's say it wasn't detailed in the right direction. So the following summer, that would be 2021, we wrote another report, which was very, very detailed about how this division should be structured, how it should be staffed. And, well, those are the two main things, structure and staffing. And we did this again with the assistance of people from UVM. Dr. Abigail Crocker, Bobby Sand had a role in it. But the really major lift was, again, the Crime Research Group and Dr. Robin Joy in particular, who did an enormous amount in helping us define what we were calling high impact, high discretion moments in encounters with the criminal and juvenile justice systems, and with where that data lay. We were very pleased by the end of it. We felt like we had unsiloed a great deal of stuff, and we should make a time capsule to hide on top of Camel's Hump for the next time that someone would need to do this kind of work. In any event, that describes why it is that our second report is going to be 2 years after 2019, which is 2023, if you take my meaning. We are currently working on that report, and what that will look like. Of course, I can't dictate, but what we are hoping, or I'm hoping at this point, is that it will look at the recommendations that were made in the report from 2019, look at what has happened, what hasn't happened, and make further recommendations based on that. In other words, in a sense, protecting the original work product and expanding upon it. We are currently meeting as subcommittees and are looking at a variety of new topics that we haven't looked at before as a panel. We're looking at second look legislation. And last night's meeting was almost entirely concerned with that particular initiative. We have a body on the juvenile justice system because many of us feel that we gave short shrift to that particular system in the first report. So we want to make sure that we really cover it very adequately in the report that will be due in December. We have a subcommittee that is looking at various community safety reports that are around through the state, trying to define or discern, I should say, really important points that may be commonalities among these that we can use for our own discussions and as a basis for making recommendations that we would bring forth to you all being legislators. And what else? We also have a responsibility to the Criminal Justice Council. That is a little slower. We will have recommendations there as well. The reason it is slower is because, as Commissioner Morrison just told you, there's been a lot of shakeup. I mean, that body, the name change is the least of it. They are going through a lot of changes, a lot of decisions. As Commissioner Morrison pointed out, there are positions that are open still. So we need to find out exactly what it is we can do for the council, and we are in discussions with them as well. And that is kind of a thumbnail sketch of who and what we are. We call ourselves the RDAP, Racial Disparities Advisory Panel. It's a lot more musical than the actual full title and easier to say. So I think that's all I have. Are there questions or comments that you all may have?
So I'll just ask one quick question, then turn it over to other folks. So I noticed yesterday at the meeting, there's ORCA was on there. Does that mean that the meetings are recorded? And if so, where are those available if somebody wanted to look at the second look? If somebody wanted to take another look at the second look?
You would be able to do that on YouTube. Orca Media, it usually takes them about 10 days, I think, to get it on there. But it's on YouTube.
Because I thought it was it was the sentencing project. There were a couple people there, one main person, Alexandra, can't remember her name. And it was if people are interested in that issue, I do recommend taking a look when that does get online. So any questions?
Just a quick comment.
Yeah,
any of the state commissions, government meetings, if you just query the meeting itself and the date, it pops up. You know, when you're in YouTube, just do the search. RDAP, date, if you know what date, or you just get RDAP and you get a list of really cool.
Right.
And this is where it helps to know that we meet on the second Tuesday of every month. So even if you don't know where you are at the time on the calendar, it's the second Tuesday of every month. That's when we meet. And
I would assume that if somebody wanted to also attend that meeting, we could get them on the Zoom list. I try to make it to those meetings. For a little while, I got off the email list, but I'm back on.
That was my fault, Representative.
Yeah, I had my second Tuesdays free for a few months. It was so, thank you actually for that. Any questions? Any other questions? I don't see any other questions. Thank you so very much.
Absolutely.
And
thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Very important work. So, do folks need a quick break now, or shall we plug through to the next folks? Break? Plug through? Okay, I think we'll. All right, we'll just keep going then. In that case, if I know that Ella had to step out just for a moment, but we'll proceed and catch her up. So, we have folks from Crime Research Group.
Live and in person.
And it's like I'm looking at Department of Corrections here. Wait.
I know. Well, I'll explain, right? I know.
Yes. So yes, please introduce yourself, Monica.
I sure will. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Weber. I am the very new, still counting in days, Executive Director of the Crime Research Group, or if you'd like acronyms, you can also call us CRG. With me today is Dr. Robin Joy. She is the Director of Research at CRG and will also be, I think, adding in and giving you more information, particularly around the data and the data sets that we have here. Many of you have been on this committee or other committees have certainly seen me over the years because prior to last week, I was with the Department of Corrections for 10 years. I still think the legislative data system needs to be caught up to. So yes, I believe the Department of Corrections is next door. All my colleagues are over there talking to you.
Although they're not next door.
Well, I don't know. Is that technically next door? They're not across the hall. They're
somewhere else.
I thought they were down the bill. I thought they were just down the hall there.
Oh,
just got
okay.
Yeah.
I'm not keeping up. So.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, I'm very happy to be here today in my role as the executive director. We wanted to come and meet you all in person. You know that we'll spend a fair amount of time talking to you this year.
Excellent. Excellent. So I assume you're going to turn it over to Robin unless you want to go into all the details after 1 week on the.
Well, it sort of depends on. I thought I could do an overview of sort of what the organization is, and I have to get my practice in, and also yes. But once we start talking about the various data sets, Robin is definitely the right person for that. But I think most of you are familiar with the Crime Research Group, but I'll just give you the short overview around our work. We're a criminal and juvenile justice research organization, nonprofit organization, established as a nonprofit in Vermont around 2014. And prior to that, we had been sort of associated with as the Vermont Center for Justice Research. So the organization has really been in Vermont since the late 80s doing this type of work, really with the goal to strengthen the justice system by providing data and research to stakeholders, legislature, municipalities, law enforcement, the public. We are an organization that can respond to just the public calling up and asking us some questions that they're interested in. And we are primarily funded through a contract with the Department of Public Safety. And so we work with Commissioner Morrison as the State Analytical Center, the SAC. And that comes with a lot of requirements in terms of collecting data, reporting data for the government. But we also have contracts and work with all other stakeholders in the criminal and juvenile justice system and can provide, technical support or evaluation and research on a number of topics. So, and we put a couple of those examples of our recent technical assistance on this sheet here. I know Eitan mentioned some of the assistance we provided to RDAP over the years. And in particular, all the work that Robin did helping with that last report. And that was actually funded through an entirely different project that we had with the National Criminal Justice Reform Project and the National Governance Association. So sometimes it's really helpful for us to be able to have those other sources of funds to be able to expand our work into other areas, because providing assistance to RDAP and the establishment of the Division of Racial Justice Statistics is going to be really important for us moving forward. So that's generally an overview. We have obviously a lot of different reports. All of our reports are available on our website. I'm happy to say that the website is going under renovation, so we'll have a new site out soon that'll be nice and easy to use. And I know that the staff's been working hard on it. I haven't done a thing for it, so. So that was like a gift to me to come in and have a a new website underway. So I'm pretty happy about that. As far as, the other staffing, and Robin is here, we have another research associate, Christopher Loris. Many of you may have met him. He may pop his head in occasionally. You'll see him around the State House. And also Megan Novak, whose expertise is really in qualitative research, but also helps do a lot of our projects. So we're a small organization trying to serve the state in a number of different ways.
So I think you're also underselling your own knowledge, and you haven't really told us what you're
Oh, well, okay. I mean,
got the data for a very long time, and we're delighted that you are with CRG.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I did spend a lot of time at the Department of Corrections, sort of managing and looking at the data that the department collects, providing a lot of reports to this committee, primarily the House Corrections and Institutions. And a lot of my work in the last few years at Corrections was focused on the justice reinvestment and working with the Council of State Governments. So that was also a really great experience and also very data heavy project. So yes, I think that's why the board of the Crime Research Group was interested in having me come in as a new executive director. So.
Plus, you have United Way experience.
Plus, yes, I do. As Representative Rachelson remembers me when I was at the United Way, and she was the executive director of Lund. So we had so the nonprofit experience is also a bonus there as well. So I guess it was the perfect storm, everything coming together. That's the way I look at it. So.
Questions? Karen?
Wonderful to see you again.
Yeah, it's nice to see you too.
This is great. Transferred along with from corrections. So familiar with CRG, but not in great detail. So I'm just reading what we do, respond to data requests from, looks like all different places. So how does that work? And then how do you pick which ones you do? And what if I just put out a request? Like how does that all
get
so prioritized?
As part of the, that's a good question. And Robin, you jump in if I don't get this right. But as part of our grant, we are supposed to provide technical assistance. And so if you called and said, I'm curious about this, and it was data that we had, and it was like a data question versus a research question, because those are two different things. And we have the data and we can readily provide it to you, then we'll just pull it and provide it to you. And we sort of put technical assistance, if it's up to 4 hours, of time, we're happy to do that at no charge, because that's something that we're required to do as an organization. A lot of times we get asked research questions. Robin will explain this in a little bit more detail, and those are harder for us to answer and might require, different sources of funding or having us put into a grant in a different way.
Right. So the folks in the community could also?
Yes,
okay.
Folks in the community. Anybody can call us, and there's there's our phone numbers on our website, and there actually is even a contact form on our website for people to fill out and put in a little request to send. I don't know how many of those that we get, but maybe you don't either, but that's okay.
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah,
it's not constant.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
Tom?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure if you're the right person, but my question would be, what sources do you mine your data from?
Well, I'd be happy to turn the chair around if we want to get into those kinds of questions, because she's really the person who's going to answer those pieces. So here's Robin. We'll transfer.
We'll transfer. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. So good afternoon. I'm Dr. Robin Joy. I'm the Director of Research. And during the pandemic, I've been the voice on the phone because I can't do Zoom. Even when Eitan was, thank you, Eitan, if you're still listening, was saying such nice things about me. I have very severe motion sickness and would pass out. So I can't look at any of that, which is why I've been on the phone this whole time. So it's nice to see you all. I'll probably go back to being on the phone, but just today, here I am, the voice. And I'm also the data chick in the attic. That's how I kind of describe myself. So yes, the data sources. We have an incredible array of sources at our fingertips. And oftentimes I have sat in this committee with my fingers on the keyboard and answered your questions in real time. Sometimes I'll be listening and I'll send you an email and answer your questions in real time. I've done that too. So I have Let's start with the court data. So we get court data from the judiciary. This is all the criminal court filings and all the criminal court dispositions. So if you want to know, for example, this is a very common question from this committee, what are the common sentences for DUI 2 with a fatality? I'm the person that you ask, and I can answer that for you in 3 minutes if I have the computer up and running, not right now. So those sorts of questions, if you want to know what percentage of charges are pled down across the counties. Let's say you want to know how many of those domestic violences really end up, and I see Sarah in my corner, how many of those domestic violences really end up as simple assaults. And so that is a whole other kind of connotation for collateral consequences of criminal convictions, doesn't it? About guns and so on. So if you want to know that, is there a difference in the counties? Traditionally, your committee and the Joint Justice have been concerned about geographical disparities, right? So I can answer those types of questions. How many people are represented by a public defender? How many people are represented pro se? And what are the outcomes for people who are represented pro se? What's the backlog? Who's backlogged? What's the timing of how long does it take to get a felony, case processed? How many cases are dismissed? How many cases are not processed? How many cases go to diversion? You name it. We'll find a way to answer that question for you. So we have that for criminal court and for criminal juvenile cases. So I'm using criminal in the wrong term. It's really status offenses, but things that would have been crimes had they been adults, but they're processed through the juvenile system. We have all of that information too. So we can tell you what this dispositions are for juveniles going through that process, what crimes are being processed, and those sorts of things. We also have things that generally you guys don't ask me about, but I want to tell you that they're there. We have civil suspensions. So DUI is one of our more common crimes, and that's been that way for the whole 17 years I've had this role. And so if you want to know how many people are challenging their civil suspensions, how many of those civil suspensions are, being won by people because of, testimony that perhaps maybe the stop wasn't good, or other reasons that you can, lawfully and rightfully, not have that suspension. We have the Judicial Bureau tickets for marijuana possession, and other things that things that would go through the Judicial Bureau that don't rise to the level of criminal behavior, but a lot of traffic offenses and things like that. We also have, I think that's about it for the court data. There's a lot of information there. And I think, sometimes you guys have wanted to know how many times a crime has been charged. That's a common one. We used to have on our website, and I'll get it back up soon, all the crimes in the state. And there are quite, wow. There's over 2,000 crimes that people can commit in this state, including all the subsections and subsections of subsections. And so we as part of a project, cataloged all of those. But I noticed that you have a fine-only bill that's going through, perhaps. So if you want to know what crimes those are, we've already cataloged those for you. You don't have to ask Eric or somebody else to do that. We can just do that. Yes.
And on that, you'd be able to tell us how many times in a certain period of time those have even been charged.
Yes. Yeah. And, we can also narrow it down because there are a lot of crimes that have never been charged. When we wrote this report, the big one was the defacing a butter crate, right? We still don't know what a butter crate is, but it's a 25 cents fine. So I feel like kind of going to the co-op, figuring out one and just leaving them the quarter. So there are things like that, that maybe aren't. But it'll be interesting to see how many of those fine-only, charges are really being charged at all, and maybe what they're attached to, right? So maybe they're having that fine-only charge, let's say defacing the butter crate, but it's also attached to a retail theft, and that's really, do you know what I mean? So we can look at that too. The other set of data that we have is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and this is the NIBRS data. This is data, and you can actually see me talking about homicides today on CAX. This is data that is every law enforcement department in the state provides. It is audited. It is uniform. It is not current as far as 2020, like we don't have 2022 yet, because it is a very rich data set. This is a data set that, again, Sarah and the network use a lot, that I use a lot. If you want to know how many of our homicides are domestic violence related, that's the data set that I look at. If you want to know what the going rate, what the average, theft is for retail theft, that dollar value, when we talked to, that was one of the requests I did for you in person. Right, I can give you that information. If you want to know where these crimes are happening, how many robberies are happening in people's homes, a lot is the answer, right, versus crimes that happen in public places. So it's a very rich data set that we have access to. The public has access to it, but it's a complicated data set. So you are free to ask any questions about that. It also has demographics about the offender, whether an arrest was made, whether a prosecution was declined, whether the victim refused to participate in the investigation. So things that touch on your work. So those are all of our data sets that we use regularly. We add to those. We add the crash data from AOT, right? Because there's a lot of information there. We add census data. The Department of Corrections has I'm still pointing to Monica. The Department of Corrections has a public use file that's up on their website. And it's a really great, but last year or last session, Representative Coburn, how many people are doing a life sentence? So I answered that for her instead of sending you to the website to figure out how to use their data set. And I can do that very quickly. So those sorts of things. And then in addition to that job of answering all those data questions, we do have all these research reports that we do. So the ones that we just finished.
So
Yep.
before you get to the research.
Sure. I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yes.
I guess what I'm looking for is maybe, do you have access to data that would indicate what's happening prior to going into the adjudication process, like in Valcourt?
We don't get an extract from Valcourt. We just get the NIBRS data. Okay. So that's what we look at. If there are data sets that are being collected, not collected. If there are data sets being created, like the traffic stop and race data, or I'm on a committee now to talk about the law enforcement contacts and what data ought to be collected there. We can do that. We can get MOUs, but each individual department owns their own data. And so we have to get the permission of the departments to do that. So that's why we use NIBRS data, which everyone contributes to. I can track the NIBRS data because I do get Vermont incident numbers, so I can track Vermont incident numbers into everywhere else.
Gotcha.
So can you explain what Valcourt is for us?
Sure. Valcourt is the dispatching and case management system for the police departments. All police departments are now using that except for a very small subsection. And that's their data system that collects everything that they do. Yeah.
Karen.
Yes, thank you. This is amazing that you exist. And
Thanks.
Wow. A question I have is I feel like there is a real difference between data collection and access and interpreting data.
Sure.
So I'm trying to, you see all the data, you have the picture. Is it up to us to ask the right questions? Do you also let us know of trends or things that you're seeing? Or is it we have to ask the right question?
If I hear you talking about something and I think that I may have something to say, I'll email you. And I think I've done that to almost everyone that's on the committee. I hear something I'll email you. You're welcome to ask. We are really small. and so, it's a combination of both. I think one thing that to be aware of that we'll be asking soon and to think about is our grants. So we get these federal grants every year and we talk to our stakeholders. What do you want to know? I have this free money coming into the state that you don't have to sign off on, right? And I get to do research. And so some of the stuff that we just recently completed, we were looking at racial equity and access to alternative programs. So one of the things that we have started to do more proactively, but is thinking about, all right, we have some really great programs, but are they serving all defendants equitably? And the answer is no, right? They're really good. I'm not going to tell you to defund them. I'm just saying that some of them aren't serving people of color And that's contributing to our disparities. That as I think that this committee has done a really great job, and this body as a whole, about implicit and explicit bias. And I think now is the next step is let's talk about that structure. Like, where are we accidentally adding to our disparities? And I'm thinking in particular of this really great court that we have in Windsor County that is never going to serve people of color. And it's a DUI court, and that's just because there aren't a lot of people of color being arrested for DUI in that area of the state. So we're taking people out of the system and giving them this really awesome evidence-based benefit, and they deserve that, but then we're leaving other people behind. And so those sorts of things we'll talk about. We also looked at victimization rates of people of color. People of color in Vermont are more likely to be victimized in violent crimes. A good thing, though, if there's a good thing out of that, is that our clearance rates, right? Our clearance rates for arrest for violent crime are the same regardless of the victim. That is not true in other jurisdictions. There are jurisdictions in this country that have a 0% clearance rate when the crime involves Black victims. So we have about the same clearance rate regardless of the victim. That's something that we're okay there, but we still have to address this other thing. Right now, we're looking at stacking of charges. How many prosecutors are adding on to the domestic violence, the interference with emergency vehicles, and X and Y, and how does that interplay and how somebody makes that decision to plea bargain? And is that uniform across the jurisdictions? Another thing that we're looking at is DUI. I haven't looked at that in probably 15 years. What's our recidivism rate for DUI ones? How are we doing? What's that trajectory for people who are having the substance use and DUI drugs? So those are research questions. We also just finished a report testing a pretrial risk assessment. A lot of things work great in what I call real cities that we don't have. And they work great in other places. They don't work great here. So this pretrial risk assessment, which would have been nice if it worked, but it doesn't work for Vermont. It has a lot of false hits. It would have increased the amount of people that you would hold on either high bail or without bail, and it had disproportionate effect on people of color. So our recommendation is, people had stopped talking about that anyways, so our recommendation was not to do that anyways. So those are some research questions. We have access to the criminal histories, to rap sheets. So those are things that people make decisions on, but that's a research question, not a call me up and can you give me this information by my committee meeting.
Thank you. I'm feeling like Karen, like, oh my gosh, it's amazing you exist. I've swim in your pool for a little while. I'm curious, your job obviously relies on the collection of like the good and
yes,
and
data quality, good data quality.
Data quality.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you can point to some areas in our state where it's done very well, and then some areas where there are challenges.
Yeah. So areas where it's done very well. So some data, there's a few things going on. When I talk about the court data, that's honestly that is accurate. It is what happens. Sometimes, and we've audited some of that, and it's pretty accurate. There may be a typo in a fine amount or something like that, but because you're dealing with people's liberty, if it was something like a typo in the sentence, that gets sorted out. DOC there's a whole calculation. So eventually, that works out. So the court data is really just kind of very mechanical. This thing was filed on this date. These were the charges. This is what happened. Where it gets the police data, the NIBRS data is heavily audited. You may see when I did this interview with CAX, he's like, how come the numbers are different today than they were a year ago? And not our crime numbers, but just the actual numbers. And it's because we audited it and somebody audited it. It's because sometimes we don't know. So we're used to being able to look something up and what's the crime rate right now? Well, we know how many people called the police yesterday and what they called them for. That has very little to do with what the crime rate is. And it takes time. So if I call the police and I say my house was robbed, I believe that, but that's not right? Robbery is the taking of property from a person with force or threat of force. My house was not robbed. My house was burglarized, but I'm calling it in as a robbery. So in some data sets, it shows up as a robbery, but the audited data sets, it shows up as what it should be, a burglary with a theft associated. The traffic stop and race data is a continued problem. And the National Police Institute just released their report, which we were very happy, confirmed a lot of the things that we had been saying over the years. There was inconsistent training. There was inconsistent definitions. There was inconsistent, there's also just problems with some people in uniform may be less computer orientated than others. Can we say that safely? So, there's that sort of stuff. We generally include in all of our reports an assessment of the data quality so that and I am always, Eitan, one of the greatest compliments that he gave me over the years was actually that I will tell you where my research is weak, and I will. I will tell you that what you can and cannot say about my research and what the asterisks are. And there's, unfortunately, because we're dealing with human behavior, there's a lot of asterisks. Getting better data quality is always a thing. With the new Bureau of Racial Justice Statistics, they'll be working with the state archivist, and she has a really great process for agencies who will be contributing data to that, to go through this data quality assessment, what's missing, what do you feel good about, what don't you feel good about, and so we can have a good idea. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Questions? So I just had a couple of questions and a request. Actually, those two recent research reports, which you did send to me, and I appreciate that. I read them. I thought they were very interesting. Raised, as they often do, more questions than anything. But
sorry. That's what research does. Yeah.
Having the question is really important. So the question, I think, punched it over to us actually. But if you could send that to Panina to put on the web under your name, so folks can see those two, the victims' impact, and then I'll call it the diversion reports.
And do you want also the one on the pretrial risk assessments, just so you can see?
Yeah, that would be great as well. So that leads to another question: is will you normally send, or I guess me in my new position, the reports? Because sometimes we don't know that the reports have.
Sometimes, I don't send them all to the chair, only because you have a lot of email. And so I think these are things that you're talking about now. So here, I will send them all to you if you want.
I think that would probably be helpful.
Okay, yes. Certainly as we see the bills come in, if there's something that we've done research on, we can certainly tell you about that as well.
Some research could prompt us to look into issues.
Yes.
And just want to make sure we don't miss those. Civil suspensions. So that's driver's license suspension, right?
Yes.
Do you have data that tells what the underlying reason for the suspension? Is it points? Is it failure to pay fines on a moving violation?
Of course, like the one data set I haven't looked at in 10 years. I'll look at it when I get home and I'll answer it. I don't think that it gets, I think it's just for DUIs. I think that's the only ones that I get for DUIs.
Okay. Yeah. If you could just let me know, because you may be taking that issue up again sometime in the session.
And Robin, it's very helpful, the specialty disaggregations that you've done.
Okay.
Especially around some of the topics that we'll be, working on, because we do archive all of that, all of those reports and sub-reports on our page. So anytime, you don't have to have a pile of paper back in the day. So that's really helpful.
Good.
We really appreciate you. Helped us get the big one across the line last year.
Yes, and we were happy to, work with Susanna's shop and ADS every week this summer. We were in a meeting, hoping to get that, sorted out. So, yes, of course, my pleasure.
Any other questions?
I'll stop.
No, don't. It's my job.
All right, so it's just a new observation I'm having. A lot of the data that you're getting from the courts and stuff like that, where I'm seeing there could be a miss, and maybe we don't even need to consider it, but it is in the field in law enforcement, for instance. There's a lot of contacts, and now they're starting to self-adjudicate a lot of these things to take some work off the court system. So are we missing that data?
Yes, and there's, let me tell you what we tried. So basically what I think you're referring to, sir, is law enforcement initiated diversion.
Correct.
Right. So you're not gonna arrest me. You're gonna send me to the diversion program, and hopefully this will work. We are not getting that data on a regular basis. There are moves to have better data collection among the diversion providers. There's a lot of laws that come down on that. So they've been, right, because you get expunged. So expungement takes a lot. I'm not making a comment on any bill. I'm just saying that there's a lot of man hours involved in expunging things. And a lot of people are subject to expungement. By the way, we're not. Don't change that. So we've done it over the years. There is a specific federal funding stream called Juvenile Disproportionate Minority Contact, where we have looked at juveniles being supported, and that's required consent of the police departments to turn over their records to look at what juveniles are being sent to, pretrial diversion or pre-charge diversion. And there's also, I think Brattleboro is maybe the only area that's actually still doing pre-charge. And they have a very robust program. But when we looked at the diversion programs to evaluate them, they said they weren't doing pre-charge. And by the way, nobody was keeping their data. So
on that, do you have a follow-up?
I do, just a little.
Yeah.
But I'm also seeing some like South Burlington, I believe, may even be doing it, where they doing like in-house, taking care of the problem.
So they're not referring to a specific diversion board at all.
Right.
Oh, they stopped.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that exasperates it even more, and more municipalities are starting.
Yeah. So, for us, that would involve, we are working with the Valcor board to get a regular extract from them. The NIBRS data is really great, but there's just some things that are not. Yeah, I don't need to. Yeah. So, and we have gone through all the MOUs when it was the Spillman board, and Spillman was the system they used before, and that was older than me. So we have the MOUs in place. It's just a question now that we kind of waited because of COVID, and then everyone switched, and so our people at a breathing spot over there. So we have a meeting with Sheriff Anderson, who's in charge of the Valcor board, next week to get that process. And if that's something that the committee, it'll be interesting to talk to law enforcement. How are they recording that? That kind of internal, I talked to so-and-so, when I used to work in England, I was a juvenile probation officer. We used to call cautioning, right? So they would bring the kid in and they would caution the kid and then they would let them go. And so how are they cautioning them? And what records are being kept? And a lot of police work and a lot of human service work, as I'm sure all of you know, isn't something that gets recorded, right? It's something like, hey, I'll just, I'm really disappointed that you did this. And that's the extent of the talking to. It may be interesting on who's getting that disappointment talk, right? But a lot of mentoring, especially for community policing, a lot of that mentoring that goes on and a lot of that, interaction is something that isn't necessarily recorded in the bureaucracy. And that's where we use qualitative research. Just throwing that out there. Yeah. So, you have a question? Go ahead, Bob.
So actually, I'm wondering if you have data broken down by prisoners that are served in state versus out of state in terms of recidivism rates?
No, not recidivism requires us to do a study. That's a study.
So you're not going to have that?
No, I won't. But Monica may.
Well, I also want to just the Department of Corrections statutorily is required to do the recidivism. I mean, you could ask Crime Research Group to do a different kind of study.
Okay. We have two different definitions. Sorry. There's two different definitions of recidivism.
Okay.
And that's the definition that the Department of Corrections is required to report on is whether or not somebody who is sentenced for a year or more committed was readmitted.
So yeah, you had to have a sentence of a year or more, and then if within the 3 years after that, where you returned to incarceration for 90
days or more. Yeah.
So it could be a probation violation.
So if you were on probation and you never had an incarcerated sentence.
You're not in the
DOC.
DOC, yes.
Right.
Okay.
The other
Yeah.
thing I want to say about your question is that the way it's done is cohorts. You're released during this calendar year, and the Department of Corrections, I'll have to stop saying we at some point. The Department of Corrections does not break down sort of where a person served their time, because as you know, there's a lot of movement
Yeah.
within that system. And so breaking it down by, it was just, Southern or, whatever the out-of-state facility was.
Yeah, we are really interested in programs though. So we're about to finish up the risk intervention services, the DOC. We did an evaluation of that. So we're going to see in those early cohorts, right? And those guys were moved around a lot in order to be able to participate in that program. So we do things like that. So we'll have that coming out by March, depending how busy you keep me.
So I have a couple questions. So in the area of restorative justice,
Yeah.
we're hoping to continue to do some good work on that this session, if not biennium. And one of the areas I would like to see, and I think the other people would like to see, is better data.
Yeah.
To track how well we're doing or not, including in pre-charge. So I guess a couple questions. One would be, are there and I'm not going to ask you to answer this question right now, sitting here, if you can think of this question, what data elements, given how much experience you have in dealing with data and looking at success rates of different programs, what data elements do you think we should be trying to generalize or make uniform across our many restorative justice programs?
Right.
Another question, just because you've dealt with data issues before, if you have a recommendation of how best we can get to that point, if we were going to set up some sort of process to figure that out. And again, you don't have to answer that right. Maybe you can answer that one right now. When you have this situation where we have a disparate number of organizations, and we want to figure out and get to the point of having uniform data sets and such, is there a process that you can recommend so we don't trip over ourselves?
Well, I think I'm not sure of a process, but I think I have two people that need to be at the table. And that is obviously all the CJCs and other organizations that are doing all of that. And they're directors who are looking at a very tight budget, and they're workers who really love the work. And let me tell you, hate data entry. And everyone hates data entry. That's not a dig at their workers. Nobody likes doing it. And then the people who are affected by the programs. I think that it's certainly been the position of CRG for a long time that you can't talk about the data without the people who are being affected by the data being present at the table about what you're going to do with the data and whether they're going to be represented in there. And their concerns are going to be represented in there. So I think, we have a tried and true process for data that includes these committees, right? And it's actually not bad. There's a lot of, on the S250 committee that I'm on, which is about collecting law enforcement data on other encounters that aren't traffic stops. It's a small working group. It's not a big public working group. It's a small working group. But we're going to say, we're going to recommend that you don't do what you normally do, bless you guys, that you make it mandatory statewide right off the bat. Don't do that, because there's a lot of working through processes. And what does it mean? Right? If you look at the traffic stop and race data, people still can't tell you if they're agreeing on whether contraband was found in the car. Right. Some people are only counting it if it's contraband that's very clearly associated with my body as the driver. And some people aren't counting, so they're not counting the contraband that was found in the passenger as well, because it wasn't mine necessarily. Some people are counting that. So these definition issues and working through those in really real world experiences before we mandate things to go statewide is really helpful. So small working groups, the people who are affected by the data have to be at the table about the data, and then really working through those nitty-gritty problems about how we interact with people in the criminal justice system, and what's realistic to to think about what analysis you're always going to do. So to go back to this committee, we had a question about recording snowmobile stops. Should we have snow? And the issue there becomes, well, what is okay, if you want to know if people of color are subjected to more snowmobile stops than white people, we can't come up with a baseline. We don't know how many people come from out of state to use our trails. We don't know what the population is of snowmobile drivers that use our trails that could possibly. And then we have the problem that that they kindly pointed out is people are wearing helmets that are really dark, right? So it's not until you pull them over and they take off the helmet that's the issue. Okay, so now maybe we have a population, but the same thing came up with hunting. We don't ask on our hunting licenses what the race is of the person that's applied for the hunting license. So we don't know if hunters of color are being harassed by Fish and Game because they're walking around the woods with guns compared to white folks for license checks. It's within the game warden's absolute right to ask you for a license when you're out there hunting. And so what is that? Is there any? We can't answer those questions because we don't know. We can listen to people and believe their experiences. And that's where the qualitative data comes in.
Can I just add something on the restorative justice piece too? Because again, coming from the Department of Corrections, you know that a lot of the money that goes to the CJCs comes through the Department of Corrections, and some CJCs are they do what the Department of Corrections grants is, and some of them are more broad, right? So there's not consistency across the programs in general around the services they offer, and then they're required to report data back to the Department of Corrections. But to Robin's point, there is no system that they all use sort of collectively to gather their data, and I know that that's something that's been in discussion for many years around what does that network look like and what's the opportunity for them to. And
I don't think that they have an executive director.
There used to be a statewide network. And that network is no longer in existence, so there's no longer a statewide director there. So now there's all the CJCs sort of as own, some of them are municipalities, some of them are their own nonprofit organizations. So, as you start to think about this, which I think is a really important conversation, and I know other communities are too, the Department of Corrections is a critical piece of that as well, because if data is going anywhere, it is going there. But it is also not.
But not for the pre-charge stuff, so they wouldn't get.
They do get sort of
how many,
because sometimes they're using their
your money,
corrections resources,
DOC's money,
corrections resources to do that work.
Self-reliant. So that definitely is the case. One other question about restorative justice. If there's been any updates to your 2019 report that talked about recidivism rates for restorative justice, if there was any plans for any follow-up work? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
No.
So you got a lovely report in 2019.
Okay.
It talked about recidivism rates for individuals who have gone into diversion.
Oh, okay. Oh, yes, that one. Okay, that was because I just want to say that in all of my years evaluating programs, that program is the most successful that I have ever seen. And I have evaluated most of your programs. And it is one of the most cost effective, and by cost, and not that you should always make decisions about cost effectiveness, but we did the cost benefit analysis on that. The cost of people going to diversion as opposed to the very cumbersome, bureaucratic, and expensive criminal justice process. And for what you get for people who are first time, it was very narrow. For people who are first time offenders, or maybe it was their second offense or something, those people did awesome. And never came back again. So no, Willa funded that the first time. I'll put it on the list to consider if to follow them up. Would you be interested in, because we do have this grant funding coming in soon. Would you be interested in that same cohort over a period of longer time, or a new cohort?
We'll have to think about that.
Okay.
We'll take that up. But the other, this is one of the reports that raised in question as well.
Okay.
It's not working as well for repeat offenders.
Right.
And of course, then we went into the pandemic and we had lots of other things to consider.
Yeah.
But, you know, the question I have, and it's not for you with data,
Yeah.
unless the data tells you something, is what do we do with those individuals? How do we make a diversion more successful? Or is there
Or something else.
option?
Yeah.
And I don't know that that's really a question for you, but that is a
Well,
question.
we can certainly look at the literature and say what evidence-based practices for that population.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Any other questions? And we'll probably be seeing you again.
Yeah, and just, it's on there, but robin@crgvt.org, and that's how you get me. And I will respond to you. You know, you guys certainly get priority, so.
One last thing,
Yeah.
if you put that 2019 report,
Yeah.
send that along as well.
Yes, I'll send that along as well.
Mention that, so
Yep.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks, Robin.
Thank you. Nice to see you all.
That was great. So we have one or two more witnesses, same organization, the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Abuse. Thank you so much. If you could introduce yourself.
Yes, absolutely. Good to see you all and see some new faces. I'm Sarah Robinson, Deputy Director at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. My colleague Jessica Barquist is also in the room. She's our Director of Policy and Organizing. And at the network, we actually have a 3-person policy team. We kind of divvy up we are generally following between 150 and 200 bills a session. And we divvy that up between the 3 of us. So you'll likely see Jessica and I in this room. Jessica tends to take a lot more of the juvenile justice related items. And we otherwise kind of divvy a lot more of our work up. And Kara Casey is our Director of Economic Empowerment. Kara does work on some economic justice issues that intersect with judiciary system issues, but you'll mostly find or see her in issues around housing and employment and things like that. So pleasure to be with you all. And I would love to tell you a little bit about the network, what we do and kind of how we fit into this larger ecosystem that you've been hearing about over the past few days. So the Vermont Network is an independent nonprofit organization. We are a membership organization and our members are 15 independent nonprofit organizations that provide direct services to victims of domestic and sexual violence across the state. And I actually have a little handy handout for you so you can go ahead and find who your local program is if that is of interest to you. But together, these 15 organizations serve every community in our state and offer very similar services. So things like there's 24-hour hotline, there's emergency and longer-term housing assistance. Advocates provide court accompaniment. They're not attorneys. They're not providing legal advice, but they'll go as an advocate with victims of domestic and sexual violence who are reporting or who are going through the criminal or civil legal process. They also offer hospital accompaniment to victims who are seeking medical care as a result of violence. And together, these organizations served just about 8,000 people in person last year and answered about 20,000 hotline calls. So we know that that's a significant undercount of the people that are actually experiencing domestic and sexual violence in our state when we look at kind of the national data and what national data tells us about prevalence of domestic and sexual violence. So the network, a lot of people think of us or refer to us as like an umbrella organization. It's actually a little bit of the opposite. So, we don't tell our members what to do. It's more like they tell us what to do. And so we consult with them and we are really their voice here in the State House and at other statewide tables, representing the voice of our member organizations. And while victims and survivors are a very diverse group of people with a diverse set of experiences and opinions, we seek to represent the voice of victims and survivors in these spaces as well. So in addition to our 15 member organizations, we also operate a few programs out of our office, statewide programs that you'll probably be hearing about in different ways, or they may come up as you discuss various bills. So I thought I'd just share a little bit about those. The first is the DIVAS program. This is a program we've operated for over 20 years in the Chittenden, it's now in the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, but it has been in whatever women's correctional facility, wherever the women have been over the past 20 years. And we have 3 staff as part of that program, and they offer advocacy services to victims of domestic and sexual violence who are incarcerated. And the national data would tell you that over 85% of women who are incarcerated in this country are victims of domestic and sexual violence at some point in their lifetime. We also hold the Vermont Forensic Nursing Program. So this is a statewide program that used to live in DCF, and some of you may remember challenges for change that happened quite some time ago, where state government was seeking other homes for programs. That program came to us then. And so what we do is we train and credential a cadre of specially trained nurses who provide medical care to victims of violence who seek care mostly in hospitals, but also in some community-based medical settings. And they also gather forensic evidence according to a standardized evidence kit that is statewide. And there's about 100 of those nurses. And so we train those nurses, we provide continuing education, lots of support for those nurses. We also host the Deaf Vermonters Advocacy Services. So that is a statewide program that provides advocacy to victims of all crimes who are deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing. And there are several advocates around the state that serve that population. And finally, I wanted to highlight the Vermont Council on Domestic Violence. That is an entity that was established in statute in 2008. And it serves as the coordinated community response to domestic violence in our state. So there's representatives from many state agencies, from the judiciary, from the faith community, and they meet quarterly and work on issues of domestic violence. But importantly, they also hold the standards and they certify the programs in Vermont who provide domestic violence accountability programming. So that's programming that serves people who are using violence in their intimate partner relationships. People are often mandated into that programming by the Department of Corrections, perhaps by DCF, and of course they will take self-referrals as well. But there are 10 of those programs that operate in the state, and the Council on Domestic Violence certifies them in accordance with some statewide standards. And you will find us serving on many study committees. If there is an interest related to victims, an interest related to domestic and sexual violence, we're often part of those statewide tables. I know one of the things Jessica does is help staff the statewide sexual harm prevention council for college campuses. That was something that was created by a bill that came through this committee a few years ago. So there are many of those tables that we sit at as well. So that's a little bit about us, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So we'll get to some questions. I'll just give a heads up to folks that we'll be seeing a few bills that
Yes.
we'll be seeing a lot of, Sarah, over the next week, starting, I think, on Friday morning, the military protective order. So questions? Yes, Ella.
Can you just touch on trends that you've seen over the last number of years?
Sure. Yeah. The last number of years have been tricky in terms of trends. As we're looking at the impact of the pandemic on people who have experienced violence. So what we know for sure is that the pandemic, especially the early stages of the pandemic, exacerbated a lot of household violence, exacerbated a lot of domestic violence, as well as unfortunately, there's some significant data that indicates there's a lot more child sexual abuse as well. And part of that is it took some time for that data to catch up, because a lot of the systems that people rely on to either identify child abuse that might be happening, or systems that are available for victims to have more regular interaction in their communities, those things were changed, or the service delivery was changed. So what our members reported, our program stayed open throughout the pandemic. Our shelters stayed open every single day of the pandemic. Hotlines were answered every single day. Is that they are seeing about the same number of victims, but that throughout the course of the pandemic, the violence that people were experiencing was more severe. And so that's kind of what we qualitatively have heard from our advocates, but that's something to watch. We also are continually looking at the rates of domestic violence related homicides in Vermont. That's a really important indicator for us. We've done a lot of work. The legislature has done a lot of work to prevent domestic violence related homicides. Typically, of all the homicides in the state, roughly half of them are domestic violence related. So we know that it is a significant driver of, the worst crime that happens in Vermont. And so we're always looking at trends and looking at those instances to understand what happened there and what unfolded and whether some systems advocacy is needed. Is that helpful?
So, as you know, I'm definitely a advocate for the nonprofit sector, and I'm wondering if you can talk about how your funding has gone.
Yeah.
Because I think that's important.
Yes. So there's kind of two stories to be told. The first is that there have been COVID relief dollars that have really helped organizations serving victims of crime, all victims of crime, kind of make it through the pandemic and to support those organizations. So federally, there have been some funds that have come in to support our member organizations. That's been fantastic. We're about to be approaching the cliff of some of that funding ending. But that I would say that those are the things that really helped our member organizations stay open throughout the course of the pandemic. The broader structural issue that we face in Vermont, and I know that you heard a little bit about this from Jennifer Pullman yesterday, is that we fund a lot of victim services in Vermont through fines and fees, through special funds. And a lot of the good work that we have been supportive of at the network and that the legislature has engaged in related to criminal justice reform has kind of unintentionally led to revenue problems in those special funds. The way that policing happens, the way traffic tickets are written, the way courts are levying fines and fees as part of criminal proceedings, those things actually not only matter for the people that are subject to those fines, but those fines also help fund victim services. So I think that that's a broader kind of policy conversation that the legislature still needs to have about, is this how we want to be funding victim services in our state, or are there other mechanisms? So we hope to be having those conversations here and in appropriations this biennium as well.
And in general, any funding that you get from general funds, do you see cost of living increases in your awards during putting the federal COVID dollars aside? Because I know that was a one-off.
No, the answer is no. I mean, we the Domestic and Sexual Violence Special Fund has primarily been flat funded since 2008.
Since 2008. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions, Angela?
Thank you for being here. And when you said that 85% of women who are incarcerated have been victims or survivors of domestic violence or sexual violence, that makes me wonder what kind of conversations does that lead to in the network about both what does that number tell you, and then what should it cause us all to think about in terms of upstream prevention and services and changes?
Yes, exactly. So that's one of the things that we love talking about is how can we adjust our efforts to be looking at how we are resourcing and looking at prevention much further upstream. Sometimes I think there is some shorthand. People tend to lump victims' issues in with thinking that, victims' interests are always going to be aligned with, say, prosecuting crimes. But the reality is that many victims of domestic and sexual violence find themselves on both sides of that equation at different points in their life. And so I think recognizing as this body has the real significant link between trauma and involvement in the criminal legal system is kind of key to the way that we approach our work, and thinking about ways that we can interrupt things that contribute to trauma really broadly. It's one of the reasons why we do a lot of work around housing and economic justice and poverty amelioration as well. That answered your question.
Yeah.
Other questions? I think we're good.
Okay,
We'll have
thank you very much.
lots over the next week.
Yes, I look forward to working with you all.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Sarah. Thank you. Right, well, that is the conclusion of the witnesses we have today, so we won't have to come back after the hopefully short floor. As I mentioned earlier, there's not going to be ethics training, so we'll all have a little time for constituent work afterwards. But before we break, I'd like to have our couple interns who are I'd like to have introduced by whoever is overseeing the interns' work.
Or should we let them?
I'm happy to let them introduce themselves, so.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wade Mullen from UVM, and I'm interning for Representative Dolan and Representative Houghton this session.
Excellent. Welcome.
My name is Jack Plato. I'm interning for Representative Rachelson. I'm excited to work with all of you throughout the coming term.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, and welcome both of you. So, and forgive me if I have to ask 3-4 more times to remember names, because I'm not really good with names.
Right there with you.